History is having a bit of a moment. You might say it's having its revenge. It's revenge on those who have misused it, abused it, forgotten it, or even tried to rewrite it.
What fantastic dreams was this humorless man dreaming as he stood at Nuremberg and looked down on his fanatic
But history is inevitable. It imposes itself on us.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
It matters not just in some detached, dusty, long gone past, in dog-eared old books in libraries, but it matters to us now, in the present. And I want to show you why, and why it's having such a comeback, why it matters so much to how we think about ourselves and the world, and politics and culture, economics, everything, and how you can wield it like a weapon. Because so many of our current global issues, from the 2008 crash to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, to wars in the Middle East, to growing inequality, to migration, or the rise of China, whichever it is, they're historical ones. And what I mean by that is how we think about them as products of history, what we think the causes of them are, how we compare them to other historical moments, determines how we respond to them and the direction we take in the future. History is alive in all of us. What I want to show you is what the historian Karl Schorsk called thinking with history. Not about history, but with it, to what he described as orient ourselves in the living present. And orienting is about direction. The direction we take individually and collectively into the future.
Coalition used overwhelming air power to defeat a brutal dictator and free a nation.
During the 90s, there was a sense that history was over, finished, done. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, the end of the historical unfolding had supposedly been reached. Monarchism, fascism, colonialism, communism, the isms had been defeated, but market liberalism, liberal democracy, was different, a different kind of ism based on undeniable universal human nature, and it had triumphed as the indisputable heavyweight champion of history. This was most notably argued in the political theorist Francis Fukuyama's provocatively titled The End of History and the Last Man. Fukuyama was only the latest in a line of thinkers like Hegel and Marx who believed that history had a direction, a logic, that it was going somewhere. Fukuyama believed in the, quote, universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government.
We usually associate history with just the routine flow of events, the war in the Persian Gulf, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But my book tries to ask a larger question, whether there is such a thing as a history of human society, taking into account the experiences of all peoples in virtually all times, and whether there is a kind of coherent evolution in the nature of those societies as they progress from, very primitive.
Fukuyama was only the most notable example of a pretty commonly held belief at the time. It was a period of optimism, triumphalism, deregulation, low inflation, and pretty high growth, supported by champagne-sipping market traders on Wall Street and in the City of London. Tony Blair said, "There has never been a time when, except in the most general sense, a study of history provides so little instruction for our present day."
Thank you.
There was a sense that even national identity no longer mattered. The West was showing the rest the future. the international businessman flying on Concorde, rational, logical, citizen of nowhere, unlimited free movement, free trade, not constrained by borders, by anything. Add in the personal computer revolution and the internet, and it was clear. The future was just around the corner. History was, well, history. The historian Eric Hobsbawm complained that most people lived in a kind of permanent present, lacking any organic relation to the public past of the times they live in.
Hard work. Greed, another name for consumer demand. And gluttony, just another term for enjoyment.
The British people have spoken, and the answer is, we're out.
That COVID-19 can be characterized as a pandemic.
All right, this is getting serious. Oh my goodness.
Police started throwing flashbang grenades and spraying mace.
More than a dozen.
But history is clearly back. Dan Carlin's Hardcore History and the Rest is History podcasts frequently hit the top of podcast charts.
Hello, today on The Rest is History, the single most exciting moment in all.
History thrives here on YouTube, and history books regularly top the non-fiction charts in bookshops. Even reenactments and family genealogy are booming. Fukuyama's thesis has been undermined by several historical forces: the rise of China's state-managed capitalist system, the growth of Islamism, the populist nationalist challenge to liberal internationalism, growing inequality, countries sliding back into authoritarianism around the world, and a general feeling that something is wrong, all of which challenge the status quo of the 90s.
The globalists can all go to hell. I have come to Texas.
But Turkey is facing a fork in the road. Can it be a functioning democracy, or is it heading for all-out autocracy?
In fact, after decades of democratic gains, we're seeing what sociologist Larry Diamond calls a democratic recession, as independent judiciaries, presidential term limits, and in some cases democracy entirely, have been curtailed or overthrown in countries around the world.
If you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
In fact, rather than liberating inevitable, rational, liberal, universal individualists, the end of the Cold War revealed older rivalries and new disagreements over national identity and borders and religion or corruption or global capitalism or inequality that had been frozen in place by the bipolar conflict between capitalism and communism, as many of those Eastern European countries were dominated by Moscow, or had been upturned by new forces of global capitalism.
В экономике бардак. Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности. Это из-за него у нас политическое место.
History then never ended. It was always simmering under the surface, ready to break out. There were frozen injustices, ethnic hatreds, financial forces, authoritarian desires and aspirations, and all of those, even though they were under the surface, were a product of a very real, living, long history. There are moments, like the 90s, when history seems to matter less, but history is always there, hiding, ready to pounce. As the historian R.G. Collingwood wrote, as long as the past and the present are outside one another, knowledge of the past is not much use in the present. But suppose the past lives on in the present. Suppose, though encapsulated in it and at first sight hidden beneath the present's contradictory and more prominent features, it's still alive and active. all of us, our minds and our bodies, and bear with me here, are constructed by history. They're imprinted with it. Our routines, our movements, our thoughts, our actions, where we go, what we think, who we are, what we do, are inherited from and directed by beliefs built up over time, across history. In his book, Why History Matters, John Tosh writes that, quote, "One of the main reasons why the present so often seems contradictory and incoherent is because what we observe or experience is marked by the residue of different historical levels. Each generation is characterised by an incongruous mixture of old and new." So even moments that seem like they're great big booming historical ruptures, periods like the 90s or the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the emergence of the internet, they all still take their shape in some way from the past that they were trying to get away from.
Stalin stages a mass meeting to greet communist representatives of the allegedly liberated Western Ukraine and Belarusia, who ask to be accepted into the Soviet Greater Ukraine.
Stalin's Russia is a great example. While communism was presented as radically new, the problems and ideas Stalin and his court inherited were the same ones the Tsars had: state repression, fear of invasion from the West, a tight-knit elite court in Moscow, a centralisation of power in a vast country, a propagandistic cult of personality. Many historians have pointed not to rupture, but continuity between the Tsars and Lenin and Stalin. Tosh writes that historical change is usually seen by historians as incremental and securely moored in a sequence of developments stretching back in time. Moments of total rupture are not ruled out, but nearly always their implied abruptness is diluted by an acute sense of the slower trajectories of change and the enduring continuities which revolution left untouched. History is always active in the present. Every person is embedded in cultures, political and social systems, family and local histories that, even if they don't consciously know it, guide how they act into the future. The Belgian writer Luc Sante said that every human being is an archaeological site. And I think the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu put it best when he said, "In each of us, in varying proportions, there is part of yesterday's man. It's yesterday's man who inevitably predominates in us, since the present amounts to little compared with the long past in the course of which we were formed." What we often forget is that everyone has a different idea of that history, of what their particular history is. And we make assumptions based on our own histories, our own views, and what we perceive or predict others' histories to be, and their reactions to what ours would be. We try and navigate through this world of different historical perspectives, some of them as wide as a gulf, and some of them quite narrow.
She was incredibly concerned, not only for her own safety, but also for the safety of her mother.
Many ordinary Russian citizens, for example, believed that Ukrainians would welcome them as liberators. Russia, in turn, has long believed it's vulnerable to invasion, from Napoleon to Hitler to NATO, to its west. Hitler believed the Slavs to be biologically inferior and to be incorporated as second-class citizens in a Great Reich. The historical chain of assumptions go on and on.
The Russian people under the regime of the Tsar were not only fighting German guns.
If history is ignored, forgotten, incorrect or abused, you might contract an unfortunate illness. Historical blindness. This discombobulating and disorienting disease leads to victims getting lost. They can't see where they're going. Historical blindness means you fumble around, bumping into others, misunderstanding them, leading to disagreement and ultimately in many cases, conflict. In her great short book, The Uses and Abuses of History, the historian Margaret Macmillan reminds us that anyone who has ever had an argument and said, "You always do that," or "I trusted you," or "You owe me one," is using history to gain an advantage in the present. And almost all of us, from heads of countries to private citizens, do it. We spin the events of the past to show that we always tend to behave well and our opponents badly, or that we are normally right and others wrong. People look at their lives as stories, but stories that involve others, other people's stories. We use history to answer questions like, who am I? Who do I identify with? Who is different to me? What are the threats? Who can I trust? What do I need to overcome? How do I get from A to B?
What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about? What you are...
If we make stories up about others, ignore their own stories, their own worldviews, if history is neglected, if we trust or blame the wrong people, then history, that genealogical series that has led up to people's experiences and views of the world in the present, it will take its revenge like a line of dominoes tumbling down.
Bitterness and longing. They are the new diaspora, refugees, exiles from Palestine. Many have lived out the years of Israel's nationhood in the squalor of the camps of Jordan and Syria, Gaza, Lebanon.
It takes honest and deep introspection about our own historical memory, what we remember too selectively as individuals and groups and nations, which memories we might have opportunistically edited.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around in other people's elections,
Macmillan reminds us that if history is the judge to which we appeal, then it can also find against us. It can highlight our mistakes by reminding us of those who, at other times, faced similar problems, but who made different, perhaps better decisions. Think about, for example, where we are today in relation to, say, China or Russia or wars in the Middle East. Think about the chain of events and the moral questions that got us where we are. Remember, that chain of events is going to differ from person to person, country to country, but we might roughly draw it like this. Germany was defeated in World War I. In the 20s and 30s, a story developed in Germany that it wasn't really defeated, but was stabbed in the back by treasonous groups domestically, liberals, socialists, and Jews in particular. At the same time, the Allies told themselves a story that Germany was to blame for the war, and so imposed harsh reparation terms and demanded German demilitarization.
By this treaty, the Germans agreed to disband the General Staff, to limit their army to 100,000 men, to hand over their fleet, to demilitarize the Rhineland and coastal fortifications.
In the 1920s, German historians produced work that argued that World War I was the fault of all of Europe, an interpretation that is much more commonly accepted today. However, at the time, these stories led to German resentment and contributed to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis.
And if the German officer had been the ideal of the Kaiser's Germany, the stormtrooper became the idol of Hitler's. Persecution was on the march.
Fast forward to the end of World War II, and the Allied story was that both the Nazis and Imperial Japan were so uniquely evil and uniquely unstoppable that both had to be defeated by unconventional means. The first, by the blanket firebombing of cities and the deaths of civilians, usually avoided by bombing military targets only, and then similarly by dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of this was presented at first, and is largely still remembered as being as unequivocally necessary because it was one of the only truly good versus evil wars. very clear-cut, the evil Hitler, Mussolini, militaristic Japan versus the liberal, democratic West. And there's many things to say about this narrative, but take just one part of that narrative, that the firebombing campaigns were unequivocally necessary. This was sacrosanct. But later records revealed that even at the time there were disagreements about whether they should do this within the Royal Air Force in Britain. Historians started to question the morality and efficacy of the firebombing campaigns, and the RAF, the Royal Air Force, objected that these debates shouldn't happen because it would damage the Air Force's reputation.
800 RAF Lancasters splashed 650,000 incendiary bombs on transportation lines in Germany's 7th largest city. They smash a big Reich roadblock across the Russian advance. Damage to Dresden, hampering the Wehrmacht, helps Konev's forces 70 miles away.
Historians then countered that history wasn't there to whitewash, and the tabloids attacked historians for telling the truth about the ambiguity, the debates about the bombing campaign in the first place. In the 1990s, the Smithsonian Institute displayed the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, that had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The exhibit encouraged visitors to think about the morality of dropping a bomb of that magnitude on an entire city. Sounds like a pretty uncontroversial moral question to ponder to me. It caused outrage on the right for suggesting moral equivalency between the US and Japan, and under pressure, the exhibit was removed and the director resigned. And there was another similar controversy in Canada over an exhibition about the firebombing campaigns. Legion magazine accused the museum of proceeding in such an insensitive and hurtful way that many air veterans feel they and their fallen comrades are being fingered as immoral, even criminal, by an institution of the very government that sent them on those harrowing missions. These historical interpretations of firebombing, nuclear weapons, blame and fault, and wider analyses of appeasing dictators and expansionism and imperialism or foreign intervention obviously animate debates we have about international relations today. These stories clearly matter. If Germany was right about not being solely to blame for the First World War, there would be justification for ameliorating some of the repayment terms which could have prevented the Second World War. So could, say, a debunking of the stab in the back myth believed by so many Germans in the 1930s.
Why then had Germany signed an armistice, Carl Schmitt asked himself. Why, a year and a half later, what he called the shame treaty of Versailles? Why was Germany, in his judgment an undefeated Germany, accepting the penalties of defeat? Bitter, sorry for himself, Carl Schmitt was looking for a scapegoat.
These stories are everywhere. During the Balkans conflicts in the 90s, Serbian nationalists painted Bosnian Muslims as fanatical invaders from the east, barbarians, despite them having lived there secularly for centuries. In Israel and Palestine, these stories are obviously at their most contentious, with hundreds, probably thousands of historical details being contested by either side.
It is Christian, it is Muslim.
These kinds of stories are everywhere, on a global scale, a national. They can be about ecological or economic issues, they can be ideological or cultural. Our collective lives are defined by them. But stories can be both fictional and factual. And when fictions are told at the expense of facts, when history is abused rather than widely understood, hubris, folly, and conflict can result.
Finally, the anger of the young Palestinians boiled over. And once more, Arab fought Arab in the streets of an Arab capital.
Macmillan writes that, quote, history can be helpful. It can also be very dangerous. It's wiser to think of history not as a pile of dead leaves or a collection of dusty artefacts, but as a pool, sometimes benign, often sulphurous, which lies under the present, silently shaping our institutions, our ways of thought, our likes and our dislikes. Quick one. I've tried to avoid ads and sponsorships so far. I like that Then and Now is fan-funded, Patreon-funded, but that means that in-depth, well-researched, long-form content like this needs your help. So if you want these videos ad-free and early and join in the discussion and get the scripts, if you want a 2-hour-long course on how historians think about history, how they do it professionally, and how you can think differently about your approach to understanding history too, if you want stuff like that and more, you can do so for as little as $1. Have a look in the link below, please. If you can't do that, then like, subscribe, share, all the rest, but a Then and Now membership will be worth your time and help the channel out. Thank you. But it's also common to hear that history doesn't teach us any lessons at all, that history doesn't repeat, although it might rhyme, or that it repeats first as tragedy and second as farce. Some say that people are the same across history, that we have a human nature that's stable over time, and others say we're culturally and socially constructed, changing across periods, unpredictable and free to escape the constraints of the past. So which one is it?
Back to that cave dweller who discovered that the power of the clenched fist, his first weapon, could be transmitted through rock and club, made more punishing through pointed tip and cutting edge.
The historian Peter Mandler, for example, has said that the kinds of lessons that history can teach are abstract. So abstract, in fact, that we ought not to call them lessons at all. They lie among the kinds of human enrichment that we look to all the arts to provide. He's talking about a kind of simple one-to-one lesson where a teachable idea like 2 + 3 = 5 is written on a chalkboard and transmitted directly into your brain, and a kind of broad lesson, human enrichment, in which all experience teaches us something, in the way that all of life is one big lesson. And there's a tension between these things in history. The idea that history never repeats, so there's no exact lessons, and that all of history is some kind of broad, enriching lesson, that all of history is important. How is it possible for these two things to be true at the same time? That history doesn't teach any lessons, and that history is important, that history matters. Tosh says, for example, that the merit of history lies in opening rather than in closing questions, in revealing options rather than insisting upon answers.
We know by then that men don't make history but are shaped by history. History takes its time.
I think there are some concrete ways of using history to teach about the present and to think about the future, and maybe even to become a better tool for prediction as our understanding of the past and the data we have available becomes more advanced, more sophisticated. The tools we use, the algorithms and the statistics and the availability of data that historians are going to work with a century into the future, it's going to become a lot easier to bring all that together to make a empirically backed argument. But under that rubric, I think we can start broadly with what I described at the beginning, Karl Schorsk calling it thinking with history, to orient ourselves in the living present, thinking with history, not thinking about history, wielding history like a tool. I think there are roughly 3 approaches: moral instruction, genealogy, and applied history. The idea that history provides moral lessons is the oldest type of history in the present kind of approach. In fact, before the modern era and the professionalisation of history as a discipline, which is as young as the 19th century, by the way, reading about great figures or moral exemplars from the past was thought to be the primary purpose of history. Today, the resurgence of interest in Stoicism or Christian ethics or philosophy and wisdom more broadly is the most obvious example of a hunger for moral lessons about how to live, how to think, how to be a decent or an effective person. And in this sense, any enduring wisdom tends to come from history and historical figures, whether that's Jesus of Nazareth, Confucius, Marcus Aurelius, Jane Austen, Karl Marx, Martin Luther King, or Kermit the Frog.
Life is not a solo act. No, it's not. It's a big, messy, delightful ensemble piece.
The second type, genealogy, was practiced most famously by Friedrich Nietzsche and Michel Foucault, and aimed to take a present set of values, ideas, or practices, a thing we all do at the moment, and then look backward to uncover their sometimes hidden roots. Ask why they came about in the first place that we don't expect. Nietzsche, for example, aimed to show how Christian values like humility had often neglected roots in the morality of ancient slave culture, and as such was a morality of slavish deference and meekness and should be overcome. Foucault aimed to show, to take just one example, that the narrative that prisons had replaced corporal punishment and torture and executions and older, inhumane disciplinary practices for humanitarian, nice, enlightened reasons neglected the point that surveillance, law and imprisonment were more about discipline and economic efficiency and power and getting the most from your population as it was about humanitarianism or liberal progress.
I've been around here an awful long time, going on 14 years. You know how long 14 years is?
For both, and for other practitioners of genealogy, the point is to take a present issue and then look backwards, uncovering hidden causes, ulterior motives, forgotten practices, and so on, that have affected how we think about the issue in the present, in the hope of inspiring a different perspective and change to how we value that thing in our contemporary era. Tosh reminds us that using history like this is actually everywhere, affecting almost everything. He says, to think in terms of sequence or process is to think historically. Every situation which requires our understanding in the present, be it a family feud, a political upheaval, or a cultural movement, is the outcome of trends and events, some of them spanning less than a lifetime, others extending back into the distant past. The third approach, applied history, takes a contemporary issue, but then searches through history for similar events that might aid our understanding of it in the present. So you're not exactly looking at how you got to where we are today, but you're taking something and looking for analogies and metaphors and similarities to help understand the meaning of it today. Is the rise of China the start of a new Cold War? Is Putin comparable to Hitler? What similarities and differences are there between multinational corporatism of the modern era and 19th century colonialism? Applied history is the search for historical analogies so that we can help frame these questions. What are we facing? Have we faced it before? What's similar and what's different? What's old and what's new? What are the risks to avoid? The routes to be taken?
On September 29th, in return for Hitler's guarantee of world peace, Chamberlain and Embeded prevailed upon Czechoslovakia to give up the Sudetenland without a fight.
The most obvious, common and maybe most tired analogy is the appeasement one, that when British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain appeased Hitler, allowing him to enter Czechoslovakia in 1938 in the hope of securing, quote, peace in our time, it actually gave Hitler the confidence to go further, ultimately leading to World War II.
And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine.
This appeasement analogy has been at the centre of US foreign policy from Korea to Vietnam to the Iraq War, and as with any analogy, it provides the basic framework of don't appease aggressors, but it can also obviously go too far, it can be misused. The Viet Cong were not the Nazis, and when Tony Blair compared Saddam to Hitler in 2003, he was making an argument from analogy, but the differences were neglected. It might have been true that Saddam was an aggressive, expansionist dictator, but he was nowhere near as powerful as Hitler. There was no chance of a continent-wide or world conflict, and the vast differences between Europe in the 1930s and the 2000s Middle East, and between American objectives and influences then and now, were left ignored.
For more than a decade, the United States and other nations have pursued patient and honorable efforts to disarm the Iraqi regime without war.
Tosh writes that most high-profile historical analogies, like the persistent recourse to Munich, are unreliable because of the unequivocal guidance which they purport to give. They assume a near identity between then and now. They deal in single causes and moral absolutes, and they're usually paraded as the only historical argument with a bearing on the present situation. But as Tosh goes on to explain, the conclusion then isn't that history doesn't matter, but that it matters even more. Analogies aren't simple. They require nuance, deep rather than surface level historical understanding, and attention to the details of tiny little similarities or differences, of nuances. Tosh writes that analogical reasoning does not rest on a presumption of complete congruence or repetition. The term itself denotes comparison of a more open-ended kind. All human beings engage in almost continuous analogical reasoning as a means of finding their bearings in constantly changing circumstances. Most of the time, we do not look for absolute repetition. We refer to our previous experience as much to establish what the present is not as to confirm what it is. When applying history to the present, when thinking with history, when wielding it as a tool, historian Ernest May advises that you take out a pen and a sheet of paper and start making a list of similarities and differences. Many can often point to similarities between the present and the past, as the current vogue for calling everyone on the right Hitler and everyone on the left a communist points to. But it's an acute eye for subtle differences that matters, and that requires really knowing your history. Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, for example, analysed 350 historical financial crises and argued, correctly by the way, in 2008, that the crash would be much longer and significantly increase public debt, more than most were saying it would at the time. So despite the difficulties, training yourself to have a keen eye for similarities and differences throughout history, to look for analogies and metaphors, is, I think, one of the best uses of history in the present. In fact, it's how the human brain works. Tosh reminds us that analogy is one of the basic reflexes of the human mind. He writes that no amount of refutation will reduce its role as a means of getting a purchase on the unfamiliar. Learning history is like building up your mental Rolodex, to be able to flick through and find the best parallels and think quickly about present problems. But analytical thinking means being able to think about the differences carefully too, and about thinking where an analogy doesn't apply. Looking to the past and seeing differences can provoke the imagination even, and look at how things can be different, can change, so that we're not chained to the past, but we use the past to get over the past. Foucault pointed out in his History of Madness that madness used to be seen as a sign of a divine spark that could contain some neglected wisdom. The ancients had very different ideas about sexuality and sexual relations. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, European thinkers, so used to believing in the divine right of kings, Christian morality or monarchical absolutism, rediscovered ideas like ancient republicanism, Greek philosophy or Roman. All of this inspired change, ultimately leading to the American and French revolutions and to modernity itself. In other words, searching for differences in the past led to revolution in the present and a better future. Tosh writes that this vantage point offers a measure of detachment from our own world, but more than that, it allows us to evaluate our world from another position and thus to entertain other possibilities for its present and future development. In many countries, liberal arts, humanities, whatever you want to call it, has been through a period of neglect. But I have a feeling and I have high hopes that things are changing and will continue to change quite a bit into the future. History is making a comeback, and more than that, I think the study of history itself will radically change over the next century. More powerful tools, AI, the amount of data on the internet we have on our phones, surveillance by the government and by big tech even, better archaeological technology, all of this, and the vast troves of data that historians in a century are going to be working with looking back, means the accuracy and usefulness and maybe the predictive power of history, its applied power, will shift too. It will become more useful. It will become more powerful. Imagine being a historian in the year 2100, 2100. I can't even think how you say that year. Looking back at the Trump era, say, at the beginning of social media and X and Facebook and memes and the vast abundance of takes, the sheer amount of data and statistics and sources and tweets and updates from ordinary people, all of that is going to change how historians work dramatically. The discipline itself has a history and has changed so much already over the past few hundred years, and that will continue to happen.
We live our history, study it, interpret its conditions and forces, make monuments to it, understand some of it, and one way or another, human history is recorded.
As Tim Hitchcock and Robert Shoemaker point out, the resources of the internet have the potential to reconfigure the relationship between the academy and the public. And so yes, history has increasingly clear benefits for anyone interested in politics, in policy, in the direction of our societies, but understanding how history and historians work isn't just about big questions like international relations or the fate of capitalism. It's about personal, more down-to-earth questions too.
And yet it's a strange thing. Even though history has as its subject dead people, history itself is not dead. In fact, it's one of the most alive of studies. It can be very fascinating, can be very interesting, can be very enthralling.
Thinking with history orients all of us. Anyone who's taken a passing interest in pop psychology, Freud, Stoicism, Christianity or Buddhism has in some way been a historian. History is a toy box of possibilities we can draw from. You can combine them to inspire and make new possibilities for the future too. As Tosh puts it, the most valuable objective of history teaching is to engage young people to situate themselves in time, to recognise the centrality of change and development in accounting for the world around them, to grasp the merits and the drawbacks of historical comparison, and to draw on the past for a richer sense of possibilities in the future. Studying all kinds of history is a way of getting out of the limitations of your own singular, finite brain and experiencing the world from somewhere or someone else. As Michael Howard argued, history can teach people, quote, how to step outside of their own cultural skins and enter the mind of others. The minds not only of our own forebearers, enormously valuable though that is, but of those of our contemporaries who have inherited a different experience from the past.
Study history, and you're really studying yourself, even though you may not think it. You're studying yourself, you're studying your neighbors, you're studying your associates. Now I ask you, what could be more interesting, more fascinating than such a study?
And Macmillan points out that history has taken the place religion once held. We think about good and evil through history, vice, virtue, moral standards, values. She says, we think about good and evil throughout history and it guides us. We take virtues and vices and moral standards and values from history and we compare ourselves to history. She says history is being called in to fill the void. It restores a sense not necessarily of a divine being, but of something above and beyond human beings. It is our authority. It can vindicate us and judge us and damn those who oppose us. In 1931, the historian Carl Becker came up with the slogan, "Every man his own history." Now, that might sound banal to us today, but that was quite a radical take for the time. It was a period when individualism was flourishing, when old conventions and routines were losing their power. Every man his own history was a kind of rallying cry for freedom within history. And I like it because it reminds me that history isn't something we take an interest in or not. Every man his own history, and every person their own history, every woman her own history. We are history. It's a part of all of us. It makes all of us. And so just as much as diet and health and our personalities or our relationships, we can choose to ignore it. We can be dragged around by it. We can let it overpower us, or we can confront it. We can understand our histories. That's up to us.
Study history, and you're really studying yourself, even though you may not think it. You're studying yourself.
Alright everyone, thank you so much as usual for watching, and I really appreciate that you've gotten this far. Just watching the video really helps with the algorithm, and a massive thank you as always to all these wonderful people on screen now who support Then and Now. As I've already mentioned, it's the only way to keep doing this without sponsorship. These long form, in-depth videos that take so much time for us to research, put together, edit, all the rest of it. So I am hugely appreciative, and we're trying to make the Patreon membership more and more valuable to you over time by adding courses. There's already a 2-hour course up on thinking differently about history that goes in depth on some of the stuff that undergraduate and postgraduate history students read about the craft of history, like thinking about history. And I think it's put together really well. People seem to enjoy it. You can join and have a look yourself. You can cancel at any time. The course membership level is $2.99 I think, but you can join for $1 and watch ad-free and early, join the discussion and the rest of it, and support videos like this. If not, please do just press subscribe, press that bell, like, comment, share, follow on social media. All that stuff helps so much. Now I'm going to go back to working on the next video. Thank you. See you next time.